Coming up on today's edition of Locked On Eagles, we have an update on the Eagles defensive coordinator search, plus our confidence level and potential replacements on both offense and defense. All that and more on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Eagles.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Welcoming Eagles fans to a Wednesday edition of the show. It's brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the NFL, and now the Locked On Podcast Network. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Louis DiBiase and Gino Camilleri continuing yet another offseason. Gino, year 6. We just did our offseason simulations on Monday and Tuesday where me and you played the role of Howie Roseman. We predicted the entire offseason, who stays in free agency, who goes, what happens in the draft. You can check that out on YouTube and all podcast platforms. But now we got the Combine starting up already next week. We're behind, man. It just feels mentally because we're still reeling from a Super Bowl loss just a few weeks ago. But the offseason waits for nobody. We got the draft coming up in free agencies in just a few weeks. It's crazy. We got to get back into it.
To put everybody's mind at ease, though, if we aren't ready for it, the outsiders, the people inside the building are. Trust me, I was at CGS last month. The scouts have been on the road. They've been doing their homework. Yes, they were watching all the games on the road, but they're focused on this 2023 draft. It's a big one. You have two first-round picks, 3 priority picks when you look at first-round and second-round picks. They really have to nail it, Lou, because if you look at the defensive side of the ball, when I went through my simulation, it was easy to come up with nearly half of the starters that could potentially be gone if you don't re-sign any of them. You look at the 2 linebackers, your 2 safeties right now, 1 of your cornerbacks, potentially depth on your defensive line, maybe one of the interior starters.
Well, you have 6 pending free agents on the defensive line right now? I mean,
it's
crazy.
It's an absurd number. And Howie Roseman, though, we hope that he had learned from what went wrong post-2017 because the Band-Aid signings didn't work. Trying to bring in older, aging veterans didn't work. They have to draft well. You hope that those guys that they had brought in last year and in the drafts past can now step into that role, i.e. Nakobe Dean, Jordan Davis, potentially Cam Jurgens, and just continue to get younger and mold around those guys, the Jalen Hurts, the Devontae Smith, the A.J. Brown. You already have a great core. Going back into 2017, going into 18, outside of your offensive line and some pieces on the defensive line, you had question marks everywhere.
Everywhere.
Sure.
Absolutely. And, Gino, that's what I wanted to get into today, starting with the defense, was our confidence level in potential replacements, because we went through our simulation and we both have the Eagles keeping a lot of these guys. They have cap space. They have Jalen Hurts still on that rookie deal. Even if they're going to sign him to that mega contract this year, you're going to have a lot of money up front. The cap goes up every single year, so I believe they can keep Javon Hargrave, Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. They can pay T.J. Edwards. They can keep guys like Marcus Epps and Brandon Graham. But at the same time, they're not going to keep everybody. They're not going to be able to also keep Fletcher Cox and Ndamukong Suh, Linval Joseph, Kazir White, James Bradbury. The list goes on. There are so many free agents, as you mentioned, on this defense. Let's say there are a few of these guys at least that leave on all 3 levels. And you mentioned Jordan Davis by name. Let's start with the defensive line at tackle. You got Hargraves, a free agent, Cox, Suh, and Joseph. Even if you keep 2 of the 4, the roles for Milton Williams and Jordan Davis are going to increase. The snap count is going to increase. Their roles are going to increase. Are you confident in, we'll start on the interior, Milton Williams, Jordan Davis, are they ready for those roles if they don't keep a lot of those veterans inside?
I think it's going to have to be a collection of everybody because that's never been the Eagles' defensive line, is that it rests and dies on one man's shoulders. It won't just be the individuals you named. I think they have high expectations of Marlon Tuipulotu as well, who put on that weight in the offseason, looked like he was filling in pretty well for the Eagles there early in the season. You would have to expect that the development of Milton Williams now going into year 3, Jordan Davis year 2, Marlon Tuipulotu year 3, a bunch of those guys that you can move inside and out as well. And we'll see what happens in terms of the defensive coordinator. How much does he like to stand Josh Sweat up? Does he want to keep Josh Sweat with his hand in the dirt? Is Hassan Reddick going to solely be a stand-up outside rusher and not go into coverage? There's a lot of things and a lot lot of variables that are still left to play. But when it comes to personnel, the turnover, it's going to be there. In PFF, they simulated it today, the top 50 free agents, and somebody from, it was PFF Brad put out the article from PFF, and Nick Corte put this out. It's regarding the comp pick calculator. The Eagles, if they let Javon Hargrave, TJ Edwards, James Bradbury, and Isaac Seumalo all walk, which is all very plausible. You could switch out maybe Kaiser White with TJ Edwards if you want to.
Yeah, Cox and Hargrave, right.
Yeah,
right.
Give or take the money on Hargrave and James Bradbury there, but the Eagles could walk away with 4 comp picks next year, Lou, and that's a big reason why.
And they're going to draft defensive linemen. I mean, that's the thing too.
That's another thing. They're either going to do two of two things. One is they're probably going to have to keep 50% of those guys that you had mentioned, whether it's one of Javon or Fletcher Cox, one of Linval Joseph. Yeah, exactly. And then you're probably going to have to draft one of those guys. Maybe it's a tweener-sized guy that you move inside and out, or just a true 3-tech that comes in and replaces potentially Fletcher Cox and Javon Hargrave. You're going to have to draft well. There's no other way around it. A lot of those free agents that are leaving are going to be on defense. You're not going to have money to bring in free agents to counteract those comp picks. But what you have to do to just subdue all of that is keep those guys in-house, keep CGJ, hopefully try and re-sign Javon Hargrave. Because the thing with the Jalen Hurts contract, Lou, is that doesn't kick in until next year. He still is going to have a manageable cap this year.
Pay Javon Hargrave, and that's why I think you have to do it. But again, Fletcher Cox, I don't think he's going to be as willing to come back on a cheaper deal like Brandon Graham would. I feel very confident that Graham's going to come back and be that third defensive end again. But Milton Williams is going to have to be a starter, I think, next year. And I'm very confident that Williams can do it. If you look at the second half of play from Williams, including in the playoffs, when this guy rarely could get into a groove because they had so many guys in front of him, and they added 2 more in Joseph and Sue in the second half. And yet he rotated as your 5th or 6th guy and constantly made plays against the run, against the pass as well. You look at, he was actually the only interior lineman this year with 4+ sacks, and he did not start a game. His motor was relentless. I'm actually really excited and confident that Williams can replace what Fletcher Cox did by a certain amount of his production. He's only, 24 years old by the time of the season. So I'm confident. And I think you look at Jordan Davis, Gino, they took him 16th overall. They traded up for this guy. I know that Linval Joseph was the more featured nose tackle per se in the second half of the season, but you got to let Jordan Davis get back into the groove. He was in the first half of the season where he was really disruptive. Just the pass rush, though, has got to come from Davis. I look at Vita Vea last year, and I watched some Tampa Bay games. I'm like, man, that is the ceiling for this kid. So, the second half, he didn't play nearly as well. He was battling injuries, but it's on Davis and Williams. Obviously, they're going to draft guys, like you said, and re-sign players, and there's always a rotation. But Davis and Williams, I mean, those are your 2 young pillars on the inside. So the pressure is going to be on, but I'm feeling pretty confident about both that they can step up in an increased role.
Well, what was one of the reasons why 2018, 19, 20, and 21, or 21, the way that they went was because you held on to a lot of those guys, the feel-good Super Bowl guys, keep them in-house. It's going to be a rough offseason in terms of the emotional portion of it, but the business side of it was that you drafted Milton Williams and Jordan Davis to be these guys' replacements. Yes, you would love to see Fletcher Cox be an Eagle for life, but if money is money and he doesn't want to stay here for what you are willing to pay him, you have to hope that your scouting department did the right thing, how he drafted the right guys, and you have to trust them, Lou. I thought Jordan Davis, even in the limited snaps that he took in the playoffs, were good enough to be a full-time starter, in my opinion. Yes, you got to get more juice when it comes to the pass rushing element of his game, but that will come with development. Let the young guys cook. It is going to be the only way forward because you're either going to have to figure out if they can play or they can't play. And if they can't play, you're going to have to find somebody else to replace them because the Band-Aid way didn't work the last go around. You have to find a new way that will completely overhaul the foundation, and not in a rebuild type of way, but something that will just strengthen it. It's like you're building an addition on your house. You already have the house, but if you're going to build that addition, you also have to build an additional foundation.
And they're not going to let all of these stars that produce last year walk, but at
No,
the same time, because they're going to be a contender. But like you mentioned, they're also not going to pay a guy like they did back then for what they've done versus what they're going to do. So it's striking that balance for sure. And then, Gino, I think when you look at linebacker, that's the other spot where there's a key replacement. Because I think you look at cornerback with James Bradberry, the Eagles don't have that guy on this roster right now that's going to replace him. I mean, that's going to have to be through the draft and or free agency. But when you look at linebacker, whether it's TJ Edwards or Kazir White, they're not paying both. One of them's going to get replaced by Nakobe Dean. And talk about confidence level, I know Dean barely played last year, but every time he stepped on the field in the preseason and the regular season, the guy made plays. You noticed him out there. He looked so confident and in control. I'm really excited to see Dean next year. I think this team is ready to move forward with him as one of your two main linebacking starters.
I think you could have started him last year, in my opinion. If
I agree.
You didn't land Kaiser White later in the season, he probably would have been a starter for you. And you got a guy who potentially could have been a first-round player if these ghost medicals that still haven't shown up someday show up.
Outside of that, he was the consensus linebacker 2 or 1 with Devin Lloyd the entire offseason.
And you got to sit him for a year. You basically redshirted him, and you saw good play out of him in those limited snaps that you did have him. So you're not going to pay $25 million to 2 linebackers. You might pay 10 to 12 to one of them, and you have Nakobe Dean on that 3rd round rookie salary for the next 3 years.
Absolutely. I'm pretty confident, Gino. I think Nakobe Dean, Jordan Davis, Milton Williams, all going to have increased roles next year, even if you keep a lot of this core together. So it's going to be exciting to watch. These were high top 3 round picks for a reason. And like you said, you got to give them a chance to play in 2023. I want to continue this conversation, but flip the field and talk about offensive replacements coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. And guys, today's show is sponsored by FanDuel. The midway point of the NBA season is here, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores and threes drained. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA, and now the Locked On Podcast Network. This is Locked On Eagles. I'm Louis DiBiase alongside Gino Camilleri. We're talking about replacements, Gino. We want to keep a lot of these guys on both sides of the ball and run it back in 2023, try to win that Super Bowl. But the NFL is a business. We know in a salary cap world, although it's a soft cap, you can't keep every single guy. You have to be disciplined and pick the right players to cash in on and to balance your roster. That's the thing, is you want to have what you had in 2022. I thought it was just a perfect balance of young players on rookie deals and veterans on bigger contracts. So you got to pick and choose. Defense, there's going to be a lot more replacements to discuss. We already did that. When it comes to offense, Gino, I think the main spots you're thinking of are, if Isaac Seumalo cashes in somewhere else, which reports are he likely will, you got to get a new starting right guard. You might need a new running back if Miles Sanders cashes in elsewhere, if you just don't want to pay the running back position. And then you got to talk about potential long-term replacements for guys like Jason Kelsey and Lane Johnson. Do you think there's a lot of those guys on this roster? Or for the offense, is it more like corner where it's they're not on this roster yet, you got to draft them eventually in through free agency?
I don't think the Lane Johnson discussion has started yet in terms of replacing him.
And I don't think the guy's on this roster for that either.
Definitely isn't. And you're good with Jordan. You're good with Lane. You hope that Cam can take one of those two positions when it comes to center or right guard, but you're going to have to replace right guard more than likely this season. Does it come in the draft? That's my expectation. I think if there was a team that is going to spend a pick in the late first round on a guard, a position that is rarely taken that early, it's the Philadelphia Eagles. And and I both went the Osiris Torrance route. Even if I
love that mock pick. I love it.
I think it's a great pick because it's a day one instant plug and play impact guy that you're not going to pay top level money to, that Isaac Seumalo is going to get. If Big V, I keep going back to this, got $50 million after the Super Bowl year, Isaac should get, I mean, heck, man, at least $50 million guaranteed.
I guess the report is a ton of teams have him as one of their top free agents in the entire market.
I would not doubt it at all.
Yeah. And you look at The replacements on the roster, Cam Jurgens, as you mentioned, he could play right guard this year if Jason Kelce comes back, but I don't think this is going to be like a Landon Dickerson thing where if he plays really well at right guard and Jason Kelce retires, they're not going to take a third center replacement in the top 2 rounds.
No.
I think Jurgens is that guy at center. So while he could be your right guard in 2023, you are going to need a more long-term player like an Osiris Torrance. And I don't love the idea. I know Jack Driscoll all offseason last year, the debate was him versus Seumalo in camp, but I don't think he's a long-term replacement. I like him as my 6th or 7th guy off the bench.
Well, what about this? What if Andre Dillard is willing to come back and he played left guard? Is he willing to go and play right guard for you? I mean, he put on the weight. They seemingly liked what they saw out of him.
I don't know though, man. In an offensive line, they always, you mentioned Big V, they get overpaid. I would love that idea, but I think Dillard is a former first-round pick is going to get paid somewhere.
I have a weird feeling he's going to get some ludicrous contract from some organization that is just betting on his traits and hoping that he can. And it's not like he's been horrible
the last 2 years when he's played. So I think they're going to bet on that upside. And again, when a needy offensive line team is looking for somebody, I think a Dillard makes a lot of sense. I think, he's going to get a good amount of money. So that's another player. You're going to need that primary tackle backup too, Gino. Even if we're talking Lane Johnson's replacement isn't for another few years, you got to have that next man up because we've seen Mailata and Lane deal with injuries.
It could be a pick at the end of the first round, and that wouldn't shock me either.
I guarantee you one of those first 3 picks is a tackle and or a guard.
Yeah, somebody who has that length to play both, that size to play both. That could be a day 2 pick.
We all want Eagles. Corners, Gino. Watch all 3 picks are going to be defensive and offensive line. This year honestly makes more sense than in the past.
It does, but the thing is, as well, if you can replace those positions, you're in a good spot because everywhere else, outside of running back, you're really trying to find role players.
Offense looks good long term. Yeah.
When I was looking at who am I going to replace, I ended up with more free agent signings on the offensive side of the ball because I figured you could get cheap guys that won't even count towards the comp pick formula. I went with Philip Dorsett to maybe come in and compete at the outside corner position with Quez Watkins. Maybe you draft another player at the end of day 3 there as well. At tight end, I went Tommy Sweeney out of from the Buffalo Bills, a guy who does have a little bit more pass catching to his repertoire than the guys they have currently with Jack Stoll, but it's role players everywhere else, in my opinion. And I think you could get by running back in this draft and this free agent class. When it comes to paying a running back, it would be the most asinine idea, in my opinion, because there are so many guys. David Montgomery's, you mentioned Devin Singletary's, all the guys that were in Miles Sanders' draft class are going to be.
If you want to buy low on a Rashad Penny because he's been
100%. This draft class is so deep. I got Sean Tucker out of Syracuse in the 3rd round. And if you could get a guy like that who could come in and has fresh legs, why would you ever pay Miles Sanders? I know he's a great player and he loves the city of Philadelphia. He said today on Instagram, like, Howie, I love you, so show me that you love me. It's terrible that this is part of the business, but ultimately the Eagles don't pay running backs. And I think if they were going to pay one of the 2 that are free agents, Boston Scott for minimum to be there with Kenny, and you bring in somebody else, whether it's via the free agent pool or the draft, I just don't see how you're going to pay Miles Sanders anywhere north of $5 million.
They have to be very disciplined.
If it's north of 5, you're not paying him.
No, I agree. But at the same time, I will say because the market is so oversaturated, like you said, maybe Sanders doesn't get the deal he's looking for. And because he loves the Eagles so much and wants to be in Philly, maybe he does come back at a lower price. But yeah, I agree. They got to be very disciplined and say, here is our line and we're not going over that no matter what, even if you tug on Howie's heartstrings, which in the past has definitely worked for guys like a Jason Peters, right, or an Alshon Jeffrey. I think when it comes to potential Sanders replacements on the roster, I like Kenneth Gainwell a lot. I thought the playoffs, we finally saw the version of Kenny G we thought we were going to see all year in his 2nd season. We didn't see that. He really struggled. I think he still is that perfect second running back in pass down situations. And maybe he's in a more committee-like approach. You know, I had them sign Devin Singletary for cheaper. Let's say you draft a guy, and maybe his role is increased in a committee. I still don't want him, Gino, to be even the number 1 running back in a committee. Like 2017, you had Jay Ajayi, you had LeGarrette Blount and Corey Clement. I still would rather have him be my Blount than my Ajayi, if that makes sense.
I get it. I'm really at the point now where when I'm looking at what the Eagles want to do at running back, the reason why they don't want to pay that guy, if you break it down to the root cause, is that they don't trust one guy to do everything at that position. Unlike when you look at wide receiver, A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, it seems like they trust both of those guys to do just about everything. But at running back, they really focus on what those guys do well. Like Kenny G, he was used a lot between the tackles on those quick hitting runs when he could just get the B gap and go. And he could be one of those pass catchers. Miles Sanders, he never got back to form as a pass catcher, and they weren't going to force it. They weren't going to do the square peg round hole approach. So if you could just find a guy that picks up that Miles Sanders, get you some explosive plays, average 5 yards a carry, I think that's a pretty easy thing to fill.
I heard a Jamal Williams suggestion today, Gino. Yeah, you're right, though. I mean, that's the one thing. I love Miles Sanders, but I would be a lot more in. I'm kind of in the middle. I struggle every day with what to do with Sanders. But if you combine the 2022 runner that is Miles Sanders and the 2019 receiver, then you can make an even more compelling case. But you're right. You make a great point that Sanders really hasn't been a receiving back. He's kind of been a LeGarrette Blount over the last few years. So that's another reason, I guess, you got to be more disciplined in if you pay him or not.
Without a doubt. And everybody that thinks they would take Bijan Robinson, as good as he is with 10.
No, I can't stand
Get it out of your head. It's not going to happen because
if you're not paying Sanders, you're not taking a running back in the first 2 rounds, in my opinion.
No,
you're just not doing it.
I don't think so either. I think there are too many late in this draft that you could bring in there as well. And positional value, when we talk about draft, it's all about positional value. The Eagles never have put day one positional value on a running back, even with the greats that they have drafted, the LaShawn McCoys, the Brian Westbrooks. These guys aren't round one backs. Like, just paint it as it is. He's not going to be taken in the first round. They'll probably sign somebody to a committee-like approach. Heck, I like the idea. I mean, sniff around if David Montgomery isn't going to cost you an arm or leg. Like,
he's very similar to Sanders too. I love the idea.
I think there's going to be one of those guys that goes for like $3.5 to $4 million per year in a team.
They're going to have to. Let's go. I think you're going to see a lot of these
out of necessity. Exactly.
Out of necessity. You're going to see a lot of these running backs have to go back to where they were, go to another team on a prove-it deal. And again, if it's Sanders, Montgomery, if there's a 1 or 2 million difference, I'm bringing in my guy. I'm bringing back my running back. But again, if it's a $3 to $4 million difference per year, you have to, again, you got to set your line with Miles and be disciplined. When it comes to his replacements, though, I think Kenneth Gainwell can be a good second guy, but I still would like to bring in somebody else to be the more featured runner in that backfield. But yeah, I think the good news, Gino, is on offense, you look at the future and it looks pretty great at receiver, tight end, the offensive line, quarterback, and running back. It's definitely not like defense.
No, not at all. And when you're in a position to where it's like the Golden State of the mid 2010s, right? Where it's like, who are we going to add to the Steph Currys, the Klay Thompsons, the Draymond? Like, that's what you have on offense. Who are we going to add? Like, who's going to be that next superstar up? Because whoever comes
in, Sean Livingston, Harrison Barnes,
exactly. Who's going to come in and reap the rewards of having 4 playmakers on offense to where you could just be the 5th and maybe even 6th or 7th and just come out in the 10 snaps that you do get. You're a great player out of the backfield. Right. And that's been something that is proven to pay deep rewards for the Eagles over the last couple of years. The Boston Scotts, the Kenny G's, the Jay Ajayi's, the Blunts, the guys that if you get them in that position for cheap, put them in a role where they succeed, it's not going to take you a lot of money to succeed at running back.
All right, Gino, we're going to go back to some defensive talk coming up next to round out the show. Some updates about the Eagles defensive coordinator search. So that's coming up on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Eagles. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. It's a Wednesday edition of the show. I'm Louis DiBiase alongside Gino Camilleri. Gino, we got to continue to talk about the defensive coordinator search. We know that they have talked to Vance Joseph. They had an interview with Jim Leonard, Wisconsin's defensive coordinator. We've got an update on that, so it looks like that's not going to happen. Leonard's going to probably sit the year out as he's getting hip surgery and focus on coaching in 2024. That was definitely a hot topic. A lot of Eagles fans like the idea of Leonard coming in. I think the good news is when you look at who these candidates are and what their philosophy is, I think the good news is a lot of these guys have more of an aggressive bone in their body versus Jonathan Gannon. And I will say, I like Jonathan Gannon's overall philosophy of win with a 4-man pass rush and stop the deep ball. In the modern day NFL, normally that's how you're going to be good. The Eagles were number 1 in a lot of defensive categories for a reason. But I think the point that me and you and a lot of people have always made, we're not Seth Joyner where we're saying blitz every single down. We just want a defensive coordinator that's more contextualized, that is more willing to be aggressive and blitz when he needs to. Just somebody that has more than just a fastball, that has a changeup and can see what the game is presenting, because nothing is more frustrating than seeing an offense beat you the same way over and over and over again. And that's all me and you have dealt with, I think, since we've started the podcast, honestly, in 2018 through 2 coordinators.
Yeah, just 2 guys that are knuckleheads and stuck in their own ways. And
just yelling about the same thing for 5 years, Gino.
And I think the ultimate cherry on the cake here was that Brian Dawkins, arguably your best defensive back ever, said that he would have hated playing for Jonathan.
Yeah, I loved listening to that. Yeah.
Because they're too passive in the back end. And the thing is, it's not like you have guys that Jalen Mills and Ronald Darby are like, okay, stay in coverage. We don't have guys that we can back you up with.
I think Schwartzhead was more justified, Gino, in doing that. Jonathan Gannon, this past year, even in 2021, you could have understood. This past year, there was no excuse, and he still did it.
No, and that was the thing that I got so excited seeing Jim Leonard's name pop up. I'm like, oh, okay, they are taking this.
Promising.
It's win with 4, but have an odd front with 2 outside backers, and you make that 4th guy always a question mark where you're rushing from, and always a question mark where the pass coverage design is going to be and where you're going to camouflage things on the back end. And I love that approach with Jim Leonard and what he does. I think Vance Joseph could be another good name that takes that same approach. Sean Desai is the one that has been brought up that is a little bit questionable to me because of what Seattle has done. They've run mostly even front principles when it comes to the front 4 over the last couple of years. They've only recently done that change to the odd front look. So Desai is questionable to me, but I think Vance Joseph would be a name that isn't just a name, would actually back up what he can do with that personnel they have there.
Gino, I feel like early on, the minute we heard Jonathan Gannon was going to the Arizona Cardinals, we probably would have bet that an in-house candidate was going to be promoted to this spot, much like Brian Johnson's going to likely be the offensive coordinator to replace Shane Steichen. But now you see they talk to Jim Leonard, Vance Joseph, they're talking to other guys across the league, and you see maybe they have more of a desire to get more aggressive. I think they want to keep a lot of their main backbone, philosophically speaking, intact with this defense. But I would think now, honestly, they might end up going with an outside hire. I mean, Denard Wilson's still a top candidate, but I don't know, man. I think they might go outside.
I think it's very telling that they want to go outside. And
I agree.
Brian Johnson is like, okay, he's inevitably going to be the offensive coordinator. I think that's a more when, not if type of thing, where the defensive coordinator approaches. Denard Wilson, he's up and coming. I think he has a place as a defensive coordinator at some point in this league, and I think it's coming sooner rather than later. Yeah. But if you weren't happy with how that season ended, and you look at the offense, you have to be head over heels with how that season ended.
Oh, yeah, I'd run it back, say, let's keep that as close to the same as possible. Yeah.
If it's not broke, don't fix it. But defense, you're saying, hey, let's at least hear some ideas. Let's at least hear some philosophies. We're not going to overhaul our personnel. We saw what happened with that when we went with that 3-4 with Billy Davis, with all those guys that were they were all even front type of players, and they went to this true odd front where BG's playing outside linebacker. The way that BG was installed last year is a way that you should put in a player like that. And you're going to have to keep that same approach because you can't overhaul all of your personnel when you use a first rounder on Jordan Davis, use the 3rd on Milton Williams. Josh Sweat is locked in. Hassan Reddick is locked in.
Yeah, you made a lot of moves to be this kind of defense.
Exactly. But to philosophically, hey, are we going to blitz in certain situations? Hey, how are we going to do things on the back end? Are we going to disguise more? Are we going to send more guys on 3rd down? What is going to be our philosophy? That's not a bad thing to hear out multiple different voices. And Jim Leonard from the college ranks, Vance Joseph, former head coach, former coordinator. I think it's good because Jonathan Gannon, as good as it was the first time he's ever been a defensive coordinator. It's the first time he's a head coach. He hasn't heard outside ideas. And Nick Sirianni, hats off to him for being willing to not just do what Doug did, right? And not just like, all right, here we go. Next guy up. I know you. You're my buddy. Nepotism. Just come on in. This is a smart approach, in my opinion. Hear outside voices. See what they're going to do. If they present different ideas with what you can do with Hassan Reddick, with what you could do with Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, be willing and able and listen to those ideas because I think going forward, you have a good foundation. but maybe you just have to adjust the furniture in the house.
I just think they're smart to use context that, yes, this defense was number one in a lot of categories. They were really good last year. A lot of teams would say, because of that, we're not going to fix anything. But I think they're smart to know, hey, when it comes to the defensive philosophy, that's where we do have room to improve, because a lot of our success last year, straight up came from personnel. Let's be real. I think the playoffs, the Super Bowl confirmed, to me at least, that the personnel was doing a lot more for Jonathan Gannon than Gannon was doing for that personnel. So I like that they're being open-minded. And yes, I think you don't want to change everything like you mentioned. I love that you mentioned the Billy Davis comparison. I think that's perfect. You don't want to change everything because, again, you had a lot of success this past year on defense. But at the same time, keep an open mind that unlike the offense, there is room to grow for sure on that side of the ball. We'll keep you guys updated on the defensive coordinator search all throughout the offseason until they make a move from Nick Sirianni and this front office. Subscribe to Locked On Eagles on all podcast platforms. We still got a show for you Monday through Friday, getting you ready for the scouting combine next week, free agency, all that and more on all podcast platforms and on YouTube as well. Make sure you hit us up on Twitter. Always Talking Birds all throughout the day at Locked On Birds, at DiBiase LOE, and at GC24_football. Thanks for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. That's going to do it for this Wednesday edition of the show. For Gino Camilleri, I'm Lou DiBiase signing off. As always, thank you for downloading. Thank you for watching and listening. And let's go, Birds.
Fly, Eagles, fly.